The bells of Ravenshade Abbey tolled not in celebration, but in warning. Their iron tongues rang through the frost-heavy air, echoing across the estate grounds where snow lay like uncut silk. Beneath the vaulted roof, beneath the gaze of 200 guests swathed in winter finery, Lady Eleanor Whitmore walked the length of the aisle toward a man whose eyes refused to rise. The Marquis of Ravenshade, Adrian Ashcombe, stood at the altar with a composure sculpted from marble. His black hair was brushed with precision, his posture impeccable, his expression vacant. There was no trace of the warmth or anticipation that should grace a groom's face. Only stillness, as though he had come to witness a ceremony, not partake in one. Eleanor's veil trembled faintly with each step. Her father had told her that happiness was a luxury, security a necessity. Marry the Marquis, he had said, and you will never know hunger nor scandal. Yet even as she neared the altar, her pulse thundered with the intuition of a creature sensing a snare. The abbey-stained glass spilled cold color over her face, blue, violet, crimson, like bruises from unseen hands. The priest's voice rose, sonorous and dutiful. Words of covenant and blessing drifted through incense and whispering silk. The congregation watched with polite hunger, their fans fluttering like moth wings. When the time came to exchange vows, Eleanor lifted her gaze. For a moment, one brief, perilous moment, she allowed herself to search his eyes for kindness. She found none. His voice was deep, precise, and almost disinterested as he repeated the formal phrases. But when the priest prompted him to declare love and fidelity, the Marquis paused. The silence was so pure that it frightened her. Then before the altar, before every soul in that sacred place, Adrian Ashcombe spoke words that froze the air itself. "You will never be my true wife." The phrase was neither shouted nor whispered. It was spoken plainly, like a verdict already long decided. A collective gasp rippled through the pews. Fans fell. Someone stifled a cry. Eleanor stood motionless, her gloved fingers clutching the bouquet, so tightly the stems cracked beneath the lace. She could not at first comprehend what had been said, only that something irreparable had just occurred. The priest faltered, searching for instruction. The guests whispered, leaning like reeds toward scandal. "Your lordship," the clergyman stammered such words. "Continue," Adrian interrupted coolly. "The ceremony will proceed." And it did, mechanically, cruelly. She repeated her vows through lips that trembled but did not break. When the ring slid onto her finger, it felt like the closing of a manacle. When the final blessing was uttered, the Marquis offered his arm. She placed her hand upon it out of instinct, not choice. Together they turned to face their witnesses, husband and wife in name only, as the organ thundered through the hollow of the abbey. Outside, snow drifted from the heavens in soft mockery. The carriage awaited. He helped her in without meeting her eyes. Inside, the velvet seats were cold, the air perfumed faintly with lavender and regret. They rode in silence for several miles, wheels cutting through slush and silence. At last she spoke, her voice a thread of composure barely holding. "You have made me an object of pity before all London." His gaze remained on the window, where his reflection wavered beside hers. "Better pity than delusion. I will not feign affection to please the crowd, nor to spare your bride humiliation." "Humiliation passes," he said, his tone too even. "A loveless union endures." She turned toward him fully. "Then why marry me at all, my lord?" He hesitated, and for the first time she saw something flicker beneath the surface of his control, weariness perhaps, or the faintest spark of old hurt. Because duty demanded it, because a title must have an heir, because society finds comfort in appearances. "And what comfort do you find, my lord?" "None." The single syllable struck her harder than cruelty could. It was not anger but absence, a void where love, or even hatred, might have lived. She looked away, feeling the first tear slip silently down her cheek. Ravenshade Manor loomed ahead, its windows lit like watchful eyes. The great doors opened as their carriage approached, servants aligned in symmetrical misery. Inside, Warmth met them, firelight flickering across portraits and polished stone. But it was the warmth of a mausoleum, not a home. A steward bowed low. "The bridal chambers are prepared, my lord." Adrian gave a curt nod, then turned to Eleanor. "You may rest. We shall dine separately." She inclined her head with grace that cost her everything. "As you wish, my lord." Upstairs, her chamber was vast and silent. A single mirror caught her reflection in cruel detail: the wilted veil, the pale mouth, the eyes of a woman newly ghosted by her own life. She sat before the mirror, removed the wedding band, and placed it on the vanity. The gold glimmered faintly, mocking her with its promise of permanence. Below, faint music drifted from the hall, musicians paid to perform for guests who had long departed. Their melodies, stripped of audience, sounded like mourning hymns. Hours passed. She undressed slowly, folded her gown with careful reverence, as though it belonged to someone else. When she lay down upon the cold bed, the canopy above her swayed with the movement of the wind. Somewhere in the manor, a door closed. She did not sleep. She waited. Near midnight, footsteps echoed down the corridor, steady, measured, unmistakable. Her heart tightened, uncertain whether she dreaded or desired their approach. But the steps did not stop at her door. They continued past, to the chamber opposite. The latch clicked softly. In the silence that followed, she heard him sigh. Then, faintly, a whisper through the thin partition, a woman's name. "Catherine." The name was spoken with such aching tenderness that Eleanor's breath caught. Not her name. Not ever her name. She rose and pressed a trembling hand to the cold wall, as though she might touch the ghost who had come between them. Catherine, the late Marchioness, whose portrait hung in the great hall, whose beauty was still murmured about at every London ball. The first wife. The true one. Eleanor sank to the floor. She wanted to hate the dead woman, but found she could not. There was only sorrow, for herself, for him, for the love he had buried but never relinquished. Snow thickened outside, whitening the world. The candle on her bedside table flickered, then steadied. She wrapped a shawl about her shoulders and went to the window. Below, the frozen gardens glimmered faintly in moonlight, statues half buried in drifts. Somewhere in that whiteness lay her future, cold, pure, unforgiving. And yet, even amid humiliation, a strange calm settled within her. The worst had already been done. There was freedom, perhaps, in having nothing left to lose. She turned from the window, resolved that if she could not command his affection, she would at least command his respect. The wind rattled the panes as though approving her vow. In the corridor beyond her door, she heard movement again, softer this time, uncertain. A pause, then retreating steps. He had approached her room, perhaps by accident, perhaps not. The silence that followed was thick with what might have been. When dawn came, she found a single white rose lying on her windowsill, rimed with frost. No note, no word. Only that fragile token trembling in the cold light, and with it the faint, treacherous pulse of hope. Spring arrived at Ravenshade with deceptive gentleness. The snow melted from the eaves, revealing the manor's black stone beneath, and the gardens stirred from their winter slumber. To the servants, it was a season of renewal. To Eleanor, it was only proof that time would move forward regardless of human sorrow. She had not spoken more than a handful of words to the Marquis since their wedding. Their lives ran parallel, but never met, two figures inhabiting the same vast house, like strangers caught in a painted tableau. They dined apart, wrote notes instead of speaking, and existed beneath the same roof without warmth or quarrel. Even indifference, she thought, requires a certain intimacy. But Ravenshade itself seemed determined to test her composure. The servants watched her with a curious sympathy, whispering of her quiet grace, her patience. In London papers, her name had become a cautionary emblem, the silent bride of Ravenshade. Eleanor had learned to endure humiliation with stillness. It was her only armor. Yet beneath that calm, something restless had begun to stir, a need not for love, but for acknowledgement. That evening, as the sun drooped low over the rose garden, she stepped outside for air. The house was suffocating with the scent of polish and loneliness. The garden, though neglected, retained a wild beauty, roses tangled with ivy, paths half swallowed by moss. The air smelled of damp earth and the first faint sweetness of spring. She walked aimlessly, fingers brushing over thorn stems, until she heard a voice call her name. "Lady Ravenshade?" She turned. At the far end of the path stood a man in the plain, dark attire of a clergyman, Thomas Lyle, once her childhood companion, now curate of the nearby parish. His smile was both hesitant and kind, the expression of one who knew her before sorrow had refined her face. "Thomas," she said softly, almost surprised by her own voice, "I did not expect to see you here." "I came to deliver correspondence for the Marchioness," he said, lifting a sealed letter. "The vicar asked that I present it in person. I confess," he added with gentle humor, "I hoped the task might allow me to see an old friend." The word friend felt both comforting and dangerous. They spoke for a time of the weather, the village, trivialities meant to disguise the ache of shared memory. She asked after his mother. He inquired whether she found Ravenshade agreeable. Her silence in response was answer enough. At last he said, "You have changed, Eleanor. The laughter has left your eyes." She smiled faintly. "Laughter is a luxury not afforded to wives of rank. I remember a girl who found joy in the smallest things," he murmured. "A girl who once climbed the old oak by the river and swore she'd never let the world make her afraid." She looked away. "That girl married a title. Then perhaps the woman she became must teach the man she married how to see her again." His words startled her with their boldness. Yet there was no impropriety in his tone, only compassion. Still, she felt the tremor of impropriety that society would eagerly seize upon. She thanked him quietly and turned toward the house, leaving him among the roses. What she did not know was that a pair of eyes had watched the entire exchange from the terrace above. The Marquis stood behind a curtain, expression unreadable, a glass of brandy cooling in his hand. He had not meant to observe, only to take in the evening air. But when he saw her white gown moving among the roses, something inexplicable held him still. The sight of her speaking with another man, smiling faintly beneath the dusk, struck him with an emotion he refused to name. Jealousy was beneath him. Yet there it was, sharp, immediate, irrational. Later that night, the household hummed with whispers. A footman had seen the curate's departure. A maid had glimpsed the Marchioness in the garden, unchaperoned. The gossip swelled like an infection, moving swiftly through corridors and parlors until it reached the Marquis himself. At breakfast the next morning, Eleanor found him waiting in the east drawing-room. He had dismissed the servants. The fire crackled low, throwing a restless glow upon his face. "Your friend, the curate," he said without preamble. "Was his visit sanctioned by the vicar or by your own inclination?" Eleanor set down her teacup with deliberate care. "He brought a letter addressed to me. I received it with courtesy. Surely even you would not call that a sin." "I would call it foolish," he said sharply. "You invite observation, my lady, and observation breeds ruin." "Ruin?" Her composure wavered, a spark of anger lighting her voice. "I have already been ruined, my lord, by your own words before the altar. What further harm can gossip do?" His jaw tightened. "You think yourself clever, but society does not forgive impropriety, even imagined. Your reputation is my concern." "Your concern," she repeated, laughing once, a brittle sound, "or your possession?" He turned away, as though her defiance stung him more than he'd admit. "Do not test my patience, Eleanor." "And do not test my dignity," she replied quietly. "It may be all I have left." They stood in silence, the distance between them a battlefield neither could cross. That evening, when the house slept, Eleanor returned to the rose garden. The moon hung low, silvering the thorns. She plucked a single rose, pale, almost white, and carried it to his study. On his desk lay papers, letters, and ledgers. She set the flower atop them, a token neither of apology nor affection, but of truth. She would no longer live invisibly. When he found it the next morning, he stared at it for a long time. Then, with an expression of disdain meant to convince himself, he threw it into the fire. The petals blackened instantly curling into ash. Yet, after the flames died, he reached into the grate and retrieved the fragile stem, half-burned but intact. He hid it in a drawer. In the days that followed, London began to murmur. A rumor had found its way into print. The Marchioness of Ravenshade entertains a certain clergyman in her gardens at twilight. The scandal rippled through drawing rooms and parlors, whispered by lips that savored every syllable. Adrian confronted her again, but this time his anger was less fury than confusion. "Why do you persist in provoking me?" he demanded. "You know how the world devours such tales." "Because silence has not saved me," she said. "Perhaps truth will." "Truth. That you cannot bear to see me living, even quietly outside your shadow." He flinched as though struck. "You presume too much." "Do I?" She met his eyes with calm defiance. "Then prove me wrong. See me, my lord, if only once, not as a duty, not as a scandal, but as a woman who refuses to vanish." Her words lingered long after she left the room. That night, he sat alone by the fire, the rose stem resting beside his glass. Her courage unsettled him more deeply than her obedience ever could. He remembered the sound of her laughter when he first glimpsed her in society. Before grief had made him cruel, before Catherine's ghost had claimed every tenderness in him. And he wondered, for the first time, whether he had mistaken pride for mourning. Days later, a letter arrived from London, bearing the seal of the Duke of Winthrop, his political patron. It summoned the Marquis to the city to address certain rumors concerning his household. He read it twice, jaw tightening. Scandal, once ignited, demanded blood or repentance. He looked toward the window, where twilight bled across the sky, and thought of Eleanor walking among the roses, unafraid of whispers. When he entered the drawing-room to deliver the news, she was seated at the piano, her fingers lingering over the keys, though no melody came. "I must leave for London," he said. She looked up, composed. "Then you shall need an escort of proper dignity." "I travel alone." She rose, crossing the room with quiet grace. "If you go to face their judgment, my lord, let them see you are not alone. I will stand beside you, if only to silence them." He stared at her, caught between admiration and disbelief. "You would defend the man who shamed you?" "I would defend my own name," she said. "And perhaps yours if you let me." The firelight caught in her eyes then, not pleading but steady strength. Something in him shifted, almost imperceptibly. For a moment, the Marquis of Ravenshade forgot his ghosts. Winter returned to Ravenshade with the quiet authority of an old monarch reclaiming his throne. Snow wove itself across the windows in pale filigree, and the air held that peculiar stillness which arrives only when the world itself seems to be holding its breath. The manor, vast and ancient, wore silence like mourning cloth. Eleanor had grown used to it, the hush of long corridors, the sound of her own footsteps fading into nothing. Yet that season, the silence felt different. It was not empty. It was expectant. The summons to London had passed in scandal's shadow. The Marquis had gone, faced his accusers, and returned with his reputation intact, but his pride diminished. The Duke had demanded an apology, the papers a statement. Adrian Ashcombe had offered neither. Instead, he had stood before the house in wordless defiance, and somehow society's hunger for shame had turned to fascination. The silent bride had not spoken, and thus she remained unsullied. The public, fickle as the weather, had found new gossip elsewhere. Now they were both prisoners of the same peace. The storm came in late December, thick, relentless snow that sealed Ravenshade from the world beyond. No carriages could pass, no letters could be sent. Servants moved like phantoms through the halls, whispering of provisions and dwindling firewood. The Marquis, confined to his estate, took refuge in his study, Eleanor in the drawing-room, where the windows looked out upon a garden buried beneath frost. It was there one evening that he found her. She sat by the fire, her embroidery abandoned on her lap, eyes fixed on the snow outside. Her hair, no longer pinned to perfection, fell loosely against her shoulders. The light gilded her in golden shadow. For a moment he simply watched, not as a husband, not even as a man, but as someone glimpsing a memory that should never have lived. "Lady Ravenshade," he said softly, his voice breaking the fragile stillness. She turned, startled, then composed herself. "My lord, I had not heard you approach. The wind conceals all manner of trespass." He crossed the room, hands clasped behind his back. "Are you not cold?" "Cold," she echoed. "I have forgotten how to feel it." There was no accusation in her tone, only weary honesty. He stood near the fire, its warmth drawing faint color into his face. "This storm may last for days," he said. "We are its unwilling captives." "Then perhaps," she replied, "it means we are meant to speak at last." The statement hung between them, daring him to refuse it. He sat opposite her, the leather armchair creaking under his weight. "You would risk another quarrel?" "I would risk silence no longer." He exhaled slowly, the sound nearer to surrender than exasperation. "Then speak." She folded her hands. "When we were wed, you condemned me before the world. You said I would never be your true wife. I endured it because I thought, perhaps, there was some wound in you that needed time to heal. I see now it is not time you lack, but faith." His eyes narrowed. "Faith. In the living," she said, "you worship the dead." The fire crackled violently, as though offended on his behalf. He rose, turning away. "You presume too much, madam." "Then enlighten me," she said quietly. "Tell me what sin I have committed by breathing in a house haunted by your grief." He looked toward the window where snowflakes hurled themselves against the glass. For a moment he said nothing. Then, in a voice stripped of grandeur, he murmured, "Her name was Catherine." Eleanor said nothing. She had known, of course. Everyone had known. But to hear him speak it, not as rumor, but confession, pierced her with an unfamiliar sympathy. "She died in this house," he continued. "In that very chamber, above the staircase. Fever. 3 days of agony. I held her hand until she no longer knew me. And when she was gone, I swore I would never love again. Love, I thought, was a weakness the grave exploited." His shoulders trembled slightly, as though the memory itself had weight. "I told myself I married you for duty, for the name, the alliance. But in truth, Eleanor, I married you because I needed a wall between myself and what remained of my heart." She rose, crossing to him slowly. "And yet you wonder why the house feels cold." He turned toward her then, his expression unreadable. "You cannot warm a man made of ash. Then why do you linger by the fire?" she asked softly. He stared at her, words deserting him. Outside, the wind howled like an ancient grief. The fire's reflection danced across their faces, turning their silence into something intimate, perilous. "You deserve more than a ghost's company," he said finally. She lifted her chin. "Then teach me how to live with one." The plea, tender and unadorned, unsettled him more than accusation ever could. He took a step toward her, then another, until the distance between them vanished into breath. He could see the faint pulse at her throat, the tremor of her lips as though she, too, feared what she had just invited. But instead of reaching for her, he sank back into the chair and pressed a hand to his eyes. "I do not know how," he confessed. "Nor do I," she said, "but perhaps learning together is less lonely than living apart." He laughed then, a sound brittle as ice cracking. "You are remarkable, Eleanor." "And you," she replied, "are terribly human, whether you wish to be or not." They sat together as the night deepened, neither speaking for a long while. The clock ticked softly, marking time that for once did not feel wasted. At length she said, "Do you believe the dead forgive us?" He looked up. "Forgive us what?" "For surviving them." He stared into the fire, the question unraveling something within him. "I do not know, but I think they might envy us for the chance to err again." Her lips curved faintly, a smile more sorrow than joy. "Then let us err gently." He studied her, this woman who had every reason to despise him, yet offered grace instead. In her stillness, he found not fragility, but strength, the kind that could endure humiliation and still choose compassion. "Eleanor," he said quietly, testing her name as though it were forbidden, "if I could undo what I said that day, She stopped him with a gesture. "You cannot, but you can speak differently now." He inclined his head, humbled. "Then hear me. You are not the shadow of another. Whatever I am capable of, respect, gratitude, perhaps something near to tenderness, it belongs to you." She met his gaze steadily. "Then, let us begin there." Snow pressed against the windows like restless spirits trying to listen. Later, when she dozed before the fire, the room still glowed with its soft, uncertain warmth. Adrian watched her for a long while, the rise and fall of her breathing, the faint flush at her cheeks. Something fragile and foreign stirred within him. Not passion yet, but peace. He stood, removed his coat, and laid it gently over her shoulders. The motion was almost reverent. For the first time in years, his touch carried no purpose but care. He turned to leave, but paused at the doorway. The firelight trembled over her face, catching the glint of tears that had dried unnoticed. The storm outside showed no sign of abating. It would trap them together another day, perhaps two. He realized, with an ache he did not understand, that he no longer dreaded the confinement. He looked once more at the sleeping woman by the fire and murmured to himself, "The moment I touched her was the moment I began to fear her power." Then he closed the door, leaving her in the flicker of firelight, and himself in the corridor, haunted not by the dead, but by the living heart he had begun at last to feel again. The thaw came late that year, as though winter itself were reluctant to release its hold on Raven Shade. Yet when it did, the world returned in color, hesitant greens, fragile blues, a sky scrubbed clean of sorrow. London, too, revived, its salons and gardens blooming with gossip, invitations, and the faint perfume of possibility. For the first time in months, Eleanor felt the stirrings of life within her. The storm that had trapped them had passed, but something gentler had remained. A quiet understanding that lived between silences and shared glances. Still, the house carried ghosts. They no longer haunted her, but they whispered, "He must speak, or the silence will return." The invitation arrived in mid-April, its seal a gilded heart, the Duchess of Winthrop's annual masquerade. Every year, it drew the most coveted names of the ton, a stage where reputations were mended or destroyed beneath masks and chandeliers. Adrian had once called it a theater for liars, but when he handed Eleanor the envelope, his voice betrayed an undercurrent of intent. "We shall attend," he said simply. She studied him. "You despise masquerades." "Indeed," he replied, "but perhaps this year I have something worth unmasking." He left her with that, as was his habit, half confessor, half enigma. Yet beneath his composure, she sensed unease, a man gathering courage for something long delayed. When the night came, the carriage moved through fog and gaslight, the city's lamps reflected like molten gold on rain-slicked streets. Eleanor's gown shimmered with muted silver, its train whispering secrets against the floor of the carriage. Her mask, ivory lace traced with pearls, revealed only her mouth and eyes, which glittered with apprehension. Adrian, beside her, wore black, a tailored coat, a mask of onyx and gold. Only his mouth, severe and sculpted, betrayed him. The air between them pulsed with things unspoken. "Why tonight?" she asked softly. He turned, his gaze unreadable beneath the mask. "Because every masquerade demands a revelation. At Winthrop House, the world dissolved into splendor. Chandeliers dripped with light, violins trembled through the marble halls, and masked figures drifted like painted illusions. Perfume and laughter mingled. Secrets changed hands beneath the fan's flutter and the champagne's fizz. Eleanor felt at once seen and unseen. The anonymity of the mask freed her. For the first time, she was not the silent bride, but a woman of her own making. She moved through the crowd with poise, receiving compliments from strangers who admired her grace without knowing her name. Adrian watched her from the edge of the ballroom, his heart caught between pride and regret. He had intended this night for redemption, a declaration, yet the sight of her radiant and untouchable made him hesitate. What right had he to speak of love when he had spent a year convincing her she would never be loved at all? The orchestra struck a waltz. A masked gentleman approached Eleanor, bowing low. May I have this dance? She glanced toward Adrian, expecting a flicker of jealousy or restraint. Instead, he nodded, a faint smile ghosting his lips. Of course, she said, accepting the stranger's hand. They moved through the crowd in elegant rhythm, the floor swirling with satin and candlelight. Her partner, tall, graceful, clearly well-born, spoke little, and she was grateful for it. For a few moments, she let herself drift, her body remembering joy. But when the dance ended and she curtsied, she found Adrian gone from his place. A servant approached. "My lady," he said discreetly, "his lordship asked that you join him in the winter gallery." Her heart quickened. She followed the servant through winding corridors, away from laughter and music, until the sounds of festivity became a faint echo. The gallery was dimly lit, lined with portraits of forgotten nobility, their eyes gleaming with oil and time. At the far end stood Adrian, unmasked. He turned as she entered, the flicker of candlelight catching the sharp planes of his face. "You dance beautifully," he said quietly. "You watched? I could not do otherwise." She removed her mask, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why bring me here, Adrian?" "Because I have carried too long the weight of a coward's silence." She froze. He approached, his expression stripped of its usual armor. "The night we wed, I gave you my name but withheld myself. I thought it noble, a punishment I alone should bear. But it was cruelty, Eleanor. I see that now." The faint tremor in his voice betrayed the storm beneath his composure. "When you entered my house, you brought light to a place that had forgotten it could burn," he said. "And I, God forgive me, spent months shuttering every window to keep it out." She stared at him, torn between disbelief and longing. "And now I find I cannot live in the dark." Her breath caught. "You think words can undo what has been done?" "No," he said simply. "But they can begin what was never allowed to begin." He reached into his coat and drew out a single object. A ring delicate, its gold band newly set with a sapphire. "I had it remade," he said. "Your wedding band. The first was chosen for duty. This one for desire." Tears stung her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. "And what would you have me do, my lord?" "Forgive me if you can, or condemn me if you must, but do not remain silent, Eleanor. Not tonight." For a long moment she said nothing. The wind rattled the tall windows, the storm of early spring muttering against the glass. "I once believed you incapable of love," she said at last. "Now I see you were only afraid of surviving it." He swallowed hard. "And now," she said, stepping closer, "I am afraid of believing you." He met her gaze, his voice breaking. "Then let me prove it." The space between them vanished. His hand rose, hesitating an instant before touching her cheek, reverent, trembling, real. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the pulse in her throat, the warmth of his palm, the nearness of what they both had feared. But she did not yield. "Not yet. You seek redemption, Adrian," she said softly. "But redemption is not claimed, it is earned." He nodded, his breath uneven. "Then let me earn it hour by hour, until the world forgets the man I was." She looked at him, truly looked, and saw not the proud Marquis, nor the haunted widower, but a man stripped bare by love's belated courage. Her hand rose, brushed his jaw with trembling fingers. "Then begin," she whispered. For a moment they stood suspended, two souls poised between ruin and rebirth. Then the clock in the ballroom struck midnight, and the first strains of a waltz drifted down the corridor, carrying laughter, life, and the echo of a world that would soon discover its own scandal, the Marquis and his wife alone in the winter gallery. He stepped back, suddenly aware of it. "We should return before." "Let them wonder," she said, lifting her mask once more. "For once, let the gossip be true." A slow, astonished smile curved his lips. He extended his hand. "Then shall we dance, my lady?" "Not as strangers," she replied. "Not anymore." They returned to the ballroom, unmasked among the masked, the crowd parting as though sensing some invisible shift. Together, they moved to the music, not perfectly, but with a grace born of surrender. And as the final note faded, he leaned close, his voice low against her ear. "Tomorrow," he murmured, "I will make public what I confess tonight." Her pulse faltered. "A declaration?" He nodded. "Before the House. Before all of London. I will tell them that my silence was a lie, and that my heart—" He stopped, glancing over her shoulder. His gaze hardened. "Adrian," she whispered. But he did not answer. Across the ballroom, near the staircase, stood a figure half-shadowed, a woman's form, still as a statue, her face concealed by a black lace mask. In her hand glimmered something that caught the light, like frost. Eleanor followed his gaze, breath freezing in her throat. For the briefest instant, the woman lifted her chin, and though her eyes were hidden, the curve of her mouth seemed to smile. Adrian's voice came out a whisper. "Impossible." The music began again, louder this time, drowning the silence that fell between them. But neither of them moved. The rain fell as if the heavens themselves were unburdening their grief upon London. Carriages splashed through the cobbled streets, their wheels throwing up silvered sheets of water. Inside one such carriage, the Marquis of Ravenshade sat rigid, his gloves soaked and his eyes shadowed by something darker than fear, recognition. Eleanor sat opposite him, her pale gown dulled by the night's dampness, her expression unreadable. Neither had spoken since the ballroom, since that moment when the phantom from Adrian's past appeared, the woman in the black mask who should have been dead. The carriage rattled, thunder grumbling above. "You saw her too," Eleanor said at last, her voice steady but low. Adrian's hand tightened around the edge of the seat. "I saw a ghost." "Then ghosts have learned to walk," she replied. "Who was she?" He hesitated, rain streaking the glass like tears. "Her name was Clara." Eleanor's eyes flickered. "Your first wife?" He nodded once. Each word dragged through anguish. "I buried her at Ravenshade 3 years ago. At least, I believe I did. The body," his voice faltered. "There was a fire. No face left to recognize." The storm outside deepened, lightning flashing across the carriage window like a wound reopened. Eleanor's pulse thrummed. "And now she stands among the living?" Adrian turned away, his profile etched in the dim glow of the carriage lamp. "If she truly lives, then everything I've built since, every oath, every confession becomes a lie." Eleanor studied him. The man she had begun to forgive, the man who had finally dared to love. "And what of me?" she asked quietly. "What becomes of your wife if another claims the title first?" He met her eyes then, anguish raw in his gaze. "You are my wife in all but name, Eleanor. If Clara breathes, then I shall face whatever damnation follows. But I will not forsake you." The carriage lurched suddenly, wheels sliding against the slick stone. The driver shouted. The horses neighed in alarm. Adrian reached instinctively across the cabin, steadying Eleanor as she pitched forward. His hand caught her waist, holding her close, too close. The scent of rain and despair lingered between them. "Adrian," she breathed, her voice trembling, "what will you do?" "I will end it," he said, jaw tightening. "If she lives, I must know why she returned now." Eleanor searched his face. "Then I am coming with you." "You cannot." "I can," she said firmly, "because whatever truth waits in that house, it concerns me as much as you." He hesitated, seeing the quiet strength in her eyes. No longer the girl he had dismissed as fragile, but the woman who now stood beside him, reign and scandal be damned. Finally, he nodded. "Then we face it together." The carriage turned toward Ravenshade. The road wound through the countryside like a black ribbon, the rain relentless, washing the world to shadow and silence. By the time they arrived, the house loomed through the mist like a great, wounded creature, its windows faintly aglow. A single lamp burned in the drawing room. Adrian entered first, his boots echoing across the marble floor. The fire crackled weakly in the hearth, throwing long, uneven shadows. And there, standing before the flames, was the woman in the black mask. Slowly she turned. The mask slipped away, and the truth was both mercy and torment. The face that emerged bore resemblance. Yes, the same pale hair, the same graceful posture, but not the same eyes. "I am not your Clara," the woman said. Her voice trembled with effort. "But I was made to be her." Eleanor drew in a sharp breath. Adrian stepped forward, disbelief written across his face. "Who are you?" "I was her maid," she said, "before the fire, before you buried her. They said she was dead, but she escaped, scarred, unrecognizable. She vanished to France, leaving debts, leaving ruin. But I was found. I was remade to play her ghost." Adrian's voice grew cold. "By whom?" A pause, and then, "By those who wanted to see you fall, to see your estate crumble under scandal. They knew your grief, your guilt. They knew the power of a dead woman's return." The words struck like thunder. Eleanor felt the floor sway beneath her, the years of whispers and pity now twisting into something crueler, orchestrated. Adrian's eyes burned. "Who sent you?" But the woman's lips only trembled. "He will come for me, if I speak." Eleanor stepped forward, her voice soft but unyielding. "Then look at me. You've done enough harm under another's name. End it under your own." The woman's gaze lifted to hers, and whatever strength had kept her silent broke. "It was Lord Fenwick," she whispered. "He said the Marquis took what was his inheritance, his position, his beloved. He wanted your shame, Adrian. He wanted her widowed again." Adrian's hands clenched at his sides. "And Clara?" "She died," the woman said, "in France. 2 winters passed." Silence swallowed the room. The rain against the windows was the only sound. Eleanor moved first. She reached for Adrian's hand, grounding him in the present, in truth. "Then it is done," she said quietly. "Your ghosts can rest." But Adrian shook his head slowly. "Not until Fenwick does." He turned toward the door, and at that instant a gunshot shattered the stillness. The woman screamed. Eleanor flinched. The windows splintered, shards raining down like crystal tears. Adrian stumbled back, his hand flying to his shoulder, blood blooming dark through the fabric. "Adrian!" He caught himself against the table, teeth gritted. "Stay back." Another shot rang out. Eleanor darted forward, seizing the fallen lamp and casting it toward the curtains. Fire caught, sudden and wild. The shadows leapt like devils across the walls. Through the smoke, a figure fled. Fenwick, his face half-mad with hatred, vanishing into the storm. Adrian sank to one knee, clutching his wound. Eleanor knelt beside him, tearing a strip from her gown to staunch the bleeding. "You're not dying," she whispered fiercely. "Not now. Not after all this." He smiled faintly, even as pain tightened his voice. "You command me like a queen." "Then obey me," she said, pressing her hand against his chest. "Live." Outside, the storm howled like a reckoning. Inside, the fire consumed what remained of Ravenshade's ghosts. By dawn, the house was in ruins, but the carriage waited once more, its roof glistening beneath the soft, forgiving rain. Adrian sat within, pale, but alive, his arm bound, his eyes on Eleanor as if seeing her for the first time. "You saved me," he said quietly. "No," she answered. "We saved what was still worth saving." The rain drummed softly against the carriage roof as it began to move, carrying them away from the ashes and into a gray morning that smelled of earth and renewal. Adrian took her hand, the gesture simple, reverent. "Eleanor," he murmured, "when I first saw you, I thought you too gentle for this world. And now," she asked, "now I know you were its courage." She turned her face toward the window, where the light broke faintly through the clouds, gilding the edges of the rain. "Then let us begin again," she said. The carriage rolled onward through the dawn, its wheels cutting through puddles that shimmered like mirrors, reflections of what had been, and what might yet be. And though the world whispered still of scandal and sorrow, the man and woman within the carriage knew the truth. That love, once kindled, could survive even the ruin of its name. Outside, the church bell tolled once for morning. Inside, he lifted her hand to his lips, a vow without words, a promise remade in rain. And when she looked at him, she saw not the Marquis of Ravensshade, but the man who had finally come home.